Hello everyone, my name is Rhys Gustinski. This is Simple Philosophy, where we simplify philosophers to help you better understand life. In today's video lecture, we're going to be looking at Karl Marx, writer of the Communist Manifesto, and we're going to be talking about him just to kind of understand where he's coming from and what his key arguments are. This is the first part of a two-series on Marx discussing his ideas, and today we're going to be looking at his critique of capitalism, we're going to be looking at the class war, and we're also going to be looking at his reputation or his post-reputation as a result of his ideas and his philosophy. If you look in the description, you'll see various timestamps which will take you to the specific sections if you are looking for something in particular. And without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing to talk about, obviously, when we're discussing Karl Marx has to be the reputation of him. He's been associated with all sorts of totalitarian dictatorships and terrorist groups, but really we need to approach Marx on his own terms. And this idea comes from the geographer, sociologist, economist David Harvey, who has done a really brilliant series on Marx and Das Kapital, which is his key work. Now, Harvey argues that when we approach Marx, we need to approach him on his own terms. Whenever we come to understand an author, we always come with preconceived notions as to how they have been potentially perceived in the media or how they have been used by other thinkers or what has been done in their name. Instead, Harvey argues we need to approach Karl Marx on his own terms, and we need to read his text as it is and how it appears, as opposed to using these preconceived notions that we come to the text with. Another key thing to point out about Karl Marx is that Karl Marx actually was not the first communist, even though he very much is associated with modern communism nowadays, particularly since he came about and started writing and publishing his work. But to talk about some other kind of communist quotes, we have the Reverend John Ball, who in the 14th century argued that things will not go well in England until all things are held in common. And this can very much be seen as an early communist idea, the idea of sharing things in common, the idea of having some sort of community and working together. Similarly, there's also Victor Duhaupas in 1777, who argued that we need to share all economic and material products between inhabitants of the commune. Of course, in this period, he's talking in the context of the French Revolution, which would be a huge influence on Karl Marx as an individual, but the idea is that these notions or understandings of communism have come before Karl Marx. My favorite example, though, of course, is August Willich, who argued that, or he essentially wanted to kill Karl Marx because he argued that Karl Marx was too conservative. Willich was an early communist, and he argued that Marx was taking communism to be this right-wing notion, or these taking it too far to the right. And so he challenges Marx to a duel where Marx sends one of his disciples to challenge him, and Willich ends up battering him as a result. Another thing to also note as well is what Marx says about Marxism itself. Obviously, Marx has been associated with Marxism. It's got his name in the title, but Marxism is a diverse theory. It's a diverse form of theory. It's made of different people that has evolved through time. So therefore there are different understandings, different conceptions of it, even though it is based on the writings of Marx. And this leads Marx to quote in 1881 to the French communists that what is certain is that I myself am not a Marxist. So even though Marxists have interpreted Marx's work in different ways, he himself might not follow everything that they have done or agree with everything that they have done. So I think that's really important to bear in mind when we approach Marx from any kind of philosophical standpoint, but not just with Marx. I think we should do it with every philosopher that we approach. We should approach them on kind of their own terms as opposed to what has been done in their name historically. Another thing to note about Marx is his modern or contemporary influence, particularly since the crash in 2008. Obviously, Karl Marx is someone who is associated with the left, progressive politics, revolution, and many of his phrases have become centerpieces for groups like the Occupy movement, Extinction Rebellion in recent years. The image that I've got on the slide here is an image from the Occupy movement after 2008 and the banking crisis, where they say we are the 99%, which echoes Marx's arguments that he has there. But whilst Marx has obviously been associated with the left and has come into a new light on the left in terms of being reappropriated, he's also taken a huge influence from the political right, particularly from businesses. And we can see on the other image that we have Karl Marx's Das Kapital marketed as a business classic, that the right are seeing him as having some answers to the crisis that capitalism is going through, obviously not in the same way that Marx would have liked to have been used or seen himself, but it shows how broad an influence Karl Marx actually has as a thinker and as a philosopher. So I'd like to get into his key concepts here today, and in particular we're going to look at the class war and his critique of capitalism. So let's get on to these key concepts now, and let's start with the very first key concept, which is going to be materialist conception of history. So Marx argues in the Communist Manifesto that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. What does he mean by this? Well, let's take a look. Essentially what he's doing is he's talking about Hegelian dialectics, or he's using Hegelian dialectics in order to come up with a conception of history as to how change happens in history and how society progresses. Now, to explain historical dialectics, essentially it works by having two things that contradict each other that create something new. So for example, we can have fire, which is one element which burns. We can have another element, which is water, which is opposed to fire, because if you pour water on fire, it then puts the fire out. So both of these things don't go together. They contradict each other. They are opposites. But when we put these two contradicting things together, they then create a new element, and that new element is steam. So by taking two contradictions, two elements, two things that contradict each other, we can create something new. And for Marx, following Hegel's example, for Marx, this is what drives history and society forward. It is this that creates progress. And Marx does a summary of this by looking at the history of different societies that have existed through time. So he begins by looking at early forms of communism, but for the sake of simplicity, we are going to look at feudalism, which, if you don't know, is the period when we were run by kings and queens and various things like that, with society being based on monarchy and peasantry and various other factors. Well, what Marx finds during this period is that contradictions start to emerge within feudalist society, which gives birth to a new type of society. That there becomes a contradiction between the monarch, the aristocratic class, and a new class that emerges, which he argues is called the bourgeoisie, who are essentially market traders. The bourgeoisie are in contradiction to the feudal monarch, and as a result of this, it then leads to a clash between the two over a long period of time, which then leads to the rise of capitalism, that we have new ideas formed by the capitalists, the ideas of liberalism, the ideas of democracy, capitalism, free trade, the right that the monarch doesn't have the right to rule, for example. These then stand in contradiction with the position of the monarchy in that society, and in a bloody revolution such as the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the bourgeoisie overthrow this system and establish a new system, and that system is capitalism. A new society is being created out of these contradictions which have exploded in a very violent way. Now, Marx argues, as he analyzes capitalism, that capitalism is not free of its own contradictions, that actually capitalism produces new relations and new contradictions within it. And this contradiction is the proletariat, or as we might refer to them, is the working class, and the bourgeoisie. In order for the bourgeoisie to make profit, as capitalism is about profit, they have to exploit and they have to undermine the role of the proletariat. And so as a result of this, they then creates this contradiction, and that the working class will eventually, much like the bourgeoisie during feudalism, the working class will overthrow the bourgeois class and establish socialism. So Marx argues that socialism in the working class is a different class, a different type of group that has emerged within society, because the working class, he argues, model their understanding and their ideas around concepts of democracy and sharing things in whole. So actually, the working class will be able to get rid of this this system, get rid of this contradictory system, and actually create a system called communism, where everything will be held in equality, the class differences disappear, and so as a result we can start living true history. So this is how Marx sees history progressing forward. There are two contradictions within society. These contradictions clash and then create a new society. So if we take a look at this, capitalism has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of old ones. So as Marx sees it, capitalism is due to end, and as part of his scientific understanding of history and historical progression, communism is inevitable. Communism is an inevitability as a result of this class war. So a really key concept to look at. So for Marxists, whenever we're looking at Marxists, whenever you're looking at socialists, this is how they believe history will move forward. And of course, more contemporary Marxists would argue as to why we have not reached this stage yet, but that's by the by for the sake of this lecture. The next thing that Marx critiques, obviously, is capitalist society on an economic front, particularly the social relations of capitalism, but also the economic critiques of capitalism. Whilst, as we've already said, Marx believes that capitalism is bad because it exploits the proletariat, it exploits these workers. And one of the central arguments that he kind of has for the working class being exploited by the bourgeoisie is this idea of work contracts, and that the bourgeoisie are constantly stealing money or resources from the proletariat, who he argues are the foundations of society. It is the workers who create society and make capitalism function, essentially. So let's think about it in a hypothetical sense as to how Marx thinks you are exploited. When you are hired by a company, let's say you have a job and you work 9 to 5. Between the hours of 9 and 12, you have already earned your wages for the day. You have already earned what your employer is going to pay you at the end of the month. So all the additional time, so from 12 till 5 o'clock, that is all profit which has been taken from you and given to your employer. So therefore, Marx argues that the employer is stealing your labor time, he is stealing your money, and as a result of this, you are being exploited. And this is just one of the ways that Marx argues that workers are being exploited in the economic productive system of capitalism. But whilst Marx has a lot of critiques of capitalism and how it runs economically, socially, historically, he also argues that capitalism has brought many benefits and advancements to society. After all, given what we've just looked at about historical progression, capitalist society is the most advanced society that we have historically ever seen. And Marx completely accepts this argument. This is not a new argument or something that the right tend to use in order to undermine his critique, because Marx fully understands this and accepts this. He argues that capitalism has brought benefits such as the revolutionizing of production, that we can produce more things now than we actually need because employers invest in technology so that we can produce more. We can essentially make enough food to feed the world over. Yep, there is more than enough resources in order to feed, clothe and water everyone. And this is a great advancement that was not seen in previous societies. That we have the ability to do this is a positive thing and a brilliant thing that capitalism has brought about in terms of productive forces. He also argues another benefit is that capitalism is a global system. It has to work around the world. It requires the whole world, different countries and different nations communicating together in order to work. And so capitalism has established global connections, which Marx believes is a good thing, a brilliant thing, in fact. But this revolutionizing of the system, this revolutionizing of production, also has negative effects. Whilst there are positives to capitalism, Marx argues there are a lot of weaknesses too. So first thing that he argues is that technology leads to unemployment. Let's think about when you go to the supermarket. Now, previously, when you would go to the supermarket, you would meet someone at a till or at a cash register, and that person would interact with you, they would scan your groceries and you would pay at the end. What we tend to see now, or happening in a lot of the retail sector now, is instead of having a cashier cashing up or cashing up your purchases, for example, we now have self-service machines which do that for us. Whilst this is convenient for the employer because they no longer have to rely on have to take into consideration human error, they no longer have to rely on workers being ill, and they have a consistent form of cheap technology that they don't have to pay apart from for maintenance. This is a positive for them because it means that they can essentially make more profit. But the problem is it will lead to unemployment, because if we're constantly revolutionizing production, there will be less jobs for these workers to do. And in capitalist society, workers rely on wages in order to survive. So therefore, capitalism can lead to mass unemployment. And Marx also argues that capitalism needs a certain level of unemployment so that the bourgeoisie can then pay a lower rate of wages to the people they are employing, because it's better to be in work and earn more money than be unemployed or on the dole, where you would earn significantly less money. So you always need what he refers to as a labor reserve in order to deal with this problem. And unemployment obviously has negative impacts for the survival of the population and humans in general in capitalist society. Similarly, he also argues that international monopolization leads to a concentration of wealth. So let's think about it in this sense, or what we mean by monopolization. Let's say in early capitalist society, there's one street and there are 3 coffee shops down that street, each with different businesses and each which make their own style of coffee and their own brand. As time progresses, we tend to find more people are going to one coffee shop instead of the others. So that coffee shop then buys the other 2. So as a result, we end up with less choice over the coffee shops that we can go to. Instead of going to the 2 small independent retailers, we are instead going to Starbucks, because Starbucks has bought up all of these independent retailers. And as a result of this, we end up with one company who owns the majority of coffee shops. Another example would of course be conglomerate companies that we see in modern society, such as Disney, for example. Not only do Disney own the rights to their own brand and their own films, Disney also own Pixar, they own Fox, they own Fox News, they also own toy companies and various other things. So regardless of the different areas you go to, regardless of capitalism saying it's about choice, in fact what actually happens is we end up giving money to the exact same conglomerate or the exact same organization, which then stifles competition and concentrates wealth in the hands of very few. To give you an idea of this, looking at the House of Commons library projections for global wealth, 1% of the world's population, that's 1% of the entire world's population, is predicted to own 63% of the global wealth by 2030. And this is a really important figure, because it means whilst 1% of the world's population are owning 63% of the wealth, 99% are going to have to fight over the remainder. And if you want to have things like a house, or the things that capitalist society tells you to buy, tells you is important and tells you is successful, you are not going to be able to achieve this. There's going to have to be more people unemployed, more people earning less in order to deal with this gap. And Marx argues that this again links to the exploitation of the proletariat. Another thing Marx argues is that capitalism has created one culture, one loosely connecting culture. And we find this in the Communist Manifesto, where we can quote here: independent but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments and systems of taxation become lumped together into one nation, with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest and one frontier and one customs tariff. So Marx argues that actually capitalism is a global system. It has to function on a global scale. And we can kind of see this happening with institutions like the United Nations, with institutions like the European Union. What they aim to do is they aim to take different territories, different cultures, different identities, different regions, and merge them into one homogeneous block, which can then be used to obviously exploit certain workers and also to sell products to create one culture. But more importantly, it establishes the dominance of one class over another on a global scale. These institutions are there to represent the bourgeoisie, to represent the bourgeois class or the ruling class, as opposed to the individuals and the cultures that have gone before. And Marx argues that this is a negative, that actually getting rid of these small cultures, getting rid of these groupings is detrimental to the existence of a lot of people, and that we're not actually entering a diverse society, despite capitalism saying it's about diversity. Instead, what we are entering into is one huge conglomerate, one huge melting pot where everybody is the same, and this is seen as a negative effect. Similarly, we can also see Marx here predicting the rise of globalization, that globalization with institutions like the IMF, the World Health Organization, we can see how they have are attempting to homogenize the capitalist system and us and our separate nations, cultures and understandings of each other. Marx also argues, and this is one of the things most people, I believe, will be familiar with in terms of Marx, is that Marx argues that capitalism is prone to economic crisis. Whilst it has been successful at revolutionizing production, it has managed to create the most advanced society that we have historically seen so far. He also argues that capitalism is inherently unstable, that we constantly go through cycles of boom and bust. Now, boom and bust, a boom is where the economy is doing well. So we can think about this in the early 2000s, late 1990s. We can see that as the most recent economic boom. But following these boom periods, there tends to be a huge economic bust, which can lead to hardship. So bust would be like the banking crisis of 2008, or more recently, the crisis that is coming as a result of the coronavirus that has taken place this year. So capitalism is prone to crisis, and when crises happen, it can then lead to have a detrimental effect on the working class, because those are the ones that are going to be fired, those are the ones that are going to lose their jobs. And as each crisis happens, Marx argues, each crisis gets worse. Each time there is a crisis, it is worse than the last one. So as each crisis happens, each crisis deepens, to simplify it in this sense. But Marx argues that crises in capitalism are different to the crises that we've seen in previous historical periods, that crises in capitalism are not due to a lack. So if we think about during feudalism or the feudal system, the reason there was an economic crisis because there wasn't enough of something. So there wasn't enough food, there wasn't enough grain due to famine. But actually, capitalism doesn't have these crises. In fact, the reason why capitalism goes into crises is because it has no limit. It actually creates too much and puts too much in the system, which it then can't sell, which then leads to a reduction in profit, which then leads society to collapsing. We only have to look at the oil situation, or the situation related to oil production during each of the lockdowns in each of the nation, which has caused a recession in oil production and for the oil companies. So therefore, crises of capitalism are not due to an issue of lack or not having enough. In fact, it's actually due to a crisis of abundance. And each time this crisis happens, each time a crisis occurs, it deepens the issues of capitalism. And Marx argues that each time capitalism falls into a crisis, this then raises the consciousness of the working class, that they see capitalism for what it is, as an exploitative system which is exploiting them financially, which is an inadequate system for their needs. And so as a result, they will overthrow capitalism when they realize the issues that have gone on. I have an image here of the boom bust cycle. So this is based on UK economic growth, and we can see everything above the line is an economic boom, but we can see that these booms are unstable. So if we look in the 1980s and 1990s, it never kind of plateaus. It is constantly up and down, but we've got several recessions that are occurring in the late 70s, early 80s, then again in the 1990s, and of course the 2007-8 recession. So Marxists would argue that this is nothing new to capitalism, that actually this boom and bust cycle is inevitable, and each time it crashes, each time it goes down, our consciousness of being exploited grows and increases as a result. I think the best way to kind of sum up this, or what Marx is saying, or the things that we've spoken about in the early part of the lecture, is to say that for Marx, the best analogy of capitalism is the Titanic. Now, the Titanic was a huge ship. I'm going to assume that we all know the film The Titanic, or the story of the Titanic and what happened. But the Titanic is an interesting ship, or an interesting historical phenomenon. It was created to show the magnitude of capitalism, the fact that we can build, or production is so efficient, we can build a huge boat, which can then essentially create a miniature society inside of it, that it shows the technological advancements of capitalism, that it had matured to a stage that we could essentially conquer nature. We can essentially build a miniature version of capitalist society on water. And so therefore the Titanic is a perfect representation of what capitalism is meant to be. Even if we go to the deconstruction of the boat, we can see that it is actually layered in a class structure, as Marx would argue capitalism has created. That at the top of society we have the bourgeoisie, or the ruling class, or the ruling elite, who sit on the top deck with adequate rooms, huge rooms, decadence, and all these various other things. In the middle, we then have the middle class, or the petty bourgeoisie. They're not quite working class. They don't work to help run the boat. Their rooms are slightly smaller, but they have a reasonably comfortable level of living in comparison to the working class. And then on the ground, or on the bottom of the boat, we have the working class, or proletariat, who are essential for the running of the boat, to make sure that it runs, essentially, to make sure that it keeps moving, to make sure that the upper class and the middle classes receive the service that they receive. But we all know what happens to the Titanic in the end, that the Titanic hits the iceberg and collapses. So if we think of the Titanic as a miniature version of capitalist society, what Marx is saying is that this society is exploitative. It exploits the working class, and we live in hierarchical structures which negatively impact the working class disproportionately. But as this society moves forward, as it continues through the sea of history, it will eventually hit the iceberg and sink, giving rise to a new society, the society of socialism and eventually communism. So hopefully that provides an adequate understanding, or condensed understanding, of Marx's economic understanding or critique of capital and class war, which could be useful if you're currently studying sociology, politics, or philosophy. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. I'm going to keep doing more of these videos. Do you think Marx was right? Do you think Marx had a point in terms of what he was doing or what he was saying? Do you think that capitalism is more efficient than communism? Do you think that capitalism is like the Titanic and it will eventually sink? Let me know down below in the comments, and I will see you in part 2 next week.